Hello and welcome to today's lesson on two proportion confidence intervals. Our objective, by the end of this lesson, I will understand how to construct a two proportion confidence interval and write a conclusion statement in context. Okay, staying with the theme of our unit, okay, going back to that Gallup poll on is college worth the cost, what we're going to look at today is what is the true difference between public and private nonprofit alumni with their thoughts on is college worth the cost? So is there a major difference between these two groups? Okay, we always start out with the same piece. Okay, testing our assumptions or conditions to make sure that we can trust our answer based on the information given. Notice that it says again a representative sample. So what we have to say is random sample, not stated in the problem. So we have one of our assumptions is not verified overall. The next thing we have to look at is independence. Okay, since we have two groups that we're looking at, we have to add on an additional level of independence calculation. We have to look at first the individual samples, and are they small enough to be an independent sample of their own? So we have 10,000 times 10 is 100,000, which is less than all public alumni. And then we have our private sample, 7,000 times 10 equals 70,000, which is less than all private alumni. Okay, so now we know that the individual samples are an independent sample from their population, but then we have to add one extra level. Public alumni and private are independent. So we have to look at and say, are these two groups independent of each other? Because if we have overlap, that would affect our situation in being able to calculate this confidence interval. Okay, so we verified independent, we weren't able to verify random, and now the last thing that we have to look at is normal sampling distribution. And here it's not just one normal sampling distribution, but it is two. So we have to break it apart into the two pieces. Here is our normal calculation that we had to do, n times p, n times 1 minus p, but since we have two samples, we have to do the calculation on both. Now, when we were doing the one sample confidence interval, the number that we were looking to exceed was 10, and we can use that number here as well. But what we can also do, since we're dealing with splitting this into two groups, is we can split that 10 into a 5 and a 5. So a little bit of a lower standard here on the individual sample size. If you want to go with 10 and stick with that value of 10 when verifying your assumptions, you can definitely do that as well. But the 5 just gives us a little bit lower of a standard because we're breaking this into the two groups situationally. So now our calculations. Once again, we always want to think about the formula sheet. The formula sheet gives us the view of what a standard deviation calculation should be for a confidence interval. And notice the main difference here, okay, larger standard deviation formula because we're having to combine the two pieces. Remember, when we're doing our statistical work, we can only work with a single value. That's why we have to find the difference of the two. So we have our public group at 0.52. We have our private group of 0.47. So we're finding the difference And initially it comes in at 5%. There's a 5% difference in the level of satisfaction between these two groups. And what we want to know is what's the range of the true value. So that's why we're building this confidence interval overall. So now we plug all the pieces into our formula, and this is, a little tedious, but you have to show the work overall. Make sure the reader of your question knows exactly what you're doing and what that value is for. Okay, so we have almost all of our pieces. The last thing that we need is our z value, which oddly is easiest to find in the t-table that's given to you on the test. Okay, so hopefully you have this as a resource. 90% confidence interval. The infinity degrees of freedom is your z value. So we're matching that piece up to get our z star value of 0.645. Okay, so now we have our three pieces. Okay, first piece, difference of the two values, our z star, our standard deviation of the statistic, which comes in at 0.00778. When these numbers start to get small, make sure that you use 3 significant figures to keep your values as accurate as possible. Okay, so we plug these into the calculator and we get our two boundary values of 0.037 on the low end and 0.063 on the high end. So now we've done all of our calculations, and the last thing that we have to do is write our conclusion statement. Remember, your conclusion needs 3 things: confidence level, the interval you created, and the context of the situation. So we look at our conclusion here. We are 90% confident that the true difference in the proportions between public and private nonprofit college alumni that thought it was worth the cost is between 3.7% and 6.3%. Okay, now this is left in proportion form with the 0.037 and 0.063. Okay, but we always can, in our heads or in our conclusion, convert it to that percentage value overall. So now, beside your Schoology quiz for homework, okay, we have our in-class packet problems that are at the beginning of the unit, looking at problems 5 and 6. Okay, we've got some interval questions in there along with some hypothesis testing. So we'll be finishing up the hypothesis testing with our next lesson. Thanks and have a good day.